Welcome back everyone to another Mythfall devlog. If you're new to the channel, I'm building a browser-based bullet hell MMO from scratch in Golang and documenting the process along the way. One of the major goals I have right now is to backfill content in Mythfall, so I've mostly been working on doing that. What that means is that I've been going through most of the biomes and making sure they have enough content to kind of stand on their own, like making sure there's enough monsters that drop like basic dungeons, there's enough like structure-based area bosses that are located in that biome, things like that. Kind of the problem that led into this issue was that when I first created the sphere, I had like a bunch of dungeons, maybe 5, and then I added like 7 biomes or so. And I had to spread those 5 dungeons across the entire map. So I kind of just like splotched them wherever I could. So that would cause things like forest themed biomes dropping from the mountain themed, forest themed dungeons were dropping from mountain themed biomes, which is a little bit weird. And it also it made the balance be very out of whack because you'd be in this like hard biome fighting these easy bosses and stuff like that. So I'm slowly like getting things back into the correct spot that they should be in, but that does require me to add new dungeons, which does take some time. So I've kind of been working on that recently. But the spot I'd like to be in is I'd like to have like an early, like a very solid early game foundation, which is what I'm trying to get to, so that I can add more like content expansions, more progression systems on top of that foundation. So getting that foundation in place is important, I think, but it will take some time. But I think that that's kind of like my current goal right now, and I'm kind of calling it like content backfill, which is the term I dubbed it. But yeah, most of these, most of the patches in this devlog are related to like the early game balance, or adding early game balance content and dungeons and stuff like that. So I moved a lot of the dungeons around. I also rebalanced a lot of the loot tables to be more generous. Before it was very, like it would be very sparse on loot when you would fight things. So I'm trying to make it a little bit easier to get into the game, because before it was a little bit of a grind just to get to like the interesting content. So I'm trying to make it easier for people to not skip the early game, but at least get enough materials to like deviate away from the early game if they want to, like into the harder content sooner rather than later. But one thing I will say is that it's very hard to balance difficulty for different player skill levels. I find that some people want really hard content really quickly, like they want to skip over all of the easy content, but then some people want to play through it. So there's this weird, I think, curve of people who will do hard content with bad gear, and then there's people who want to do the hard content with really good gear. So I'm trying to make both cases and everything in between fit well, but it is a little bit hard to keep all of that balance for every single player type. So, but yeah, I do have some other ideas on how to make things balanced out for like really good players and newer players. So, but I'll save that for another devlog, I think. But in terms of making the early game a little bit easier to get materials for, I added these resource nodes that I randomly spawn around the sphere. That way, when you're exploring, you might stumble upon like a little rock with some gold sticking out of it, and you can destroy it to get like a loot chest that basically gives you some extra gold or iron or whatever material the resource node was. So I think that helps newer players like get more materials easier on, you know, not that materials are that hard to get regardless, but they drop from monsters, but now they also drop from these little resource nodes. I think that also incentivizes exploration a little bit. So I do like that feature as well. The other thing I wanted to improve was minimap visibility. So I wanted people to be able to group up more easily. So people need to be able to see on their minimap when there's a nearby portal, when there's a nearby structure, when there's a nearby like area boss, things like that, so that they can like kind of group up and like find this stuff together. So what I did, at least temporarily, was I added this extended like player vision for just the minimap where the minimap will show like these nearby, I guess, events all around you, and you can kind of like pick and choose what thing you're going to go to. So hopefully that'll help let people group up a little bit more easily. I don't think it like completely solves the problem, but I think it improves it a little bit, which I'm happy with, I guess. The next thing I worked on was redoing all of the abilities. Before, the ability pages were kind of scattered across all of the dungeons, so I changed it, and now it's kind of one ability book can be completed just by doing a single dungeon. So if you go into a dungeon a few times, you'll eventually get different pages from the boss drop. And then you can take those pages to the librarian who's in town, who will craft you the ability book. Then you can start using that ability book, which is kind of like the best version of the ability page spells. So that caused me, because I have like, I think I've got like 10 dungeons or something like that now. Yeah, so because I have like 10 dungeons now, I had to come up with a bunch of different abilities. And a lot of them, what I did was I'll make like a status effect that the ability gives you. So for example, some abilities give you status effects that improve your movement speed or give you like health rejuvenation over time. And one of them is like a little bit dangerous. It'll like give you a bleed status effect, but it'll give you bonus lifesteal. So there's a lot of like interesting stuff I can do with those. So I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. I think they create a lot of interesting like itemizations based off of what the player wants or what they value. I think there is a little bit of a meta still, which I don't love. I would rather people have different builds all the time and like people like playing with different things, but I see a lot of people with the same gear. But it is very hard to make two things exactly equal, you know, but with different like concepts, you know, so I'm still working on that. But anyways, we can move on to the new dungeons and bosses that I added. I added this new Iron Golem fight in Gumbo Forest. I think it's a good like intro to boss fights type fight because it's pretty easy, but there is this bug where people can kite him around like a pet, and they'll like kite him all the way to the beach and like kill new players with this like mid game, or not really mid game, but early game boss, I guess. But like if you're a brand new player, you have no idea what's going on. It's a little bit scary, I'd assume. But this was something I didn't expect to happen. But I guess I'll have to add some kind of maximum roam distance or something, and that'll fix that. But the next big dungeon that I added was one called the Volcanic Mines. It drops from monsters in Scorched Summit, and it's on the harder side of a 3-skull dungeon. But in this boss fight, I wanted to experiment a little bit with explosions, so I kind of mostly focused on that. I gave the monsters in the dungeon a little bit of extra guard, but most people don't seem to like that because it nullifies their damage immediately. So a lot of players do not like that very much. So I will probably change that or add some kind of armor pen or something like that. But once you defeat the Dwarven King boss, he drops another dungeon level called the Volcanic Core that you can go into, and you can fight this next like fire golem boss who drops Mithril, which is the next material progression after Obsidian. And then once you get that material ore, you can use the Lava Forge, which is a deeper level in the dungeon, to craft the Mithril ore into Mithril bars, and then eventually create your Mithril items. So I think that's a cool little like final material progression to have. So I'm happy that that's finally in the game, because this was something that I wanted to have in the game for quite a while. So I'm glad it's in finally now. I also spent some time, I wanted to go back through the old boss fights and improve them. So I went through the Anubis fight, which was probably one of the most hated boss fights I've ever designed. But in my defense though, it was actually one of the first like hard bosses that I built. So I didn't really know what I was doing. And I ended up making it hard in a tedious way rather than in a fun way, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a weird balance to strike. But I think this one's a lot better now, and people seem to like the changed one, which is good. But yeah, I'm at least happy that I'm getting better at designing them. I'm finally like understanding what features I like from boss fights. One of the other dungeon-related feedbacks that I had was the pathing system, or not the pathing system, but rather the path that got generated in the dungeon. It could be very inconsistent. Sometimes you'd end up with these dungeon paths where you'd be in the spawn room, and then there'd be two paths that go in completely different directions. So you'd have to guess at the very start, am I going to go right or am I going to go left? And you might pick wrong, have to backtrack the entire dungeon and then redo all of it to find the actual boss fight of the dungeon. So I changed how the dungeons are generated mostly. So now it's like one main path, and there's small little branching paths that fork off of the main path that don't go as far though. So if you do, so there is some guesswork still, but if you choose wrong, you don't have to backtrack the entire path. You just have to backtrack like 1 or 2 rooms to get back to the main path. So that feels a lot better. And I do find myself, or before I found myself very frustrated when I would test dungeons on my dev branch. But now that I have this new pathing in place, I feel a lot less like frustrated because I can kind of like see where it's going and follow that path. And I don't have to clear the entire dungeon most of the time. So that's kind of nice. Anyways, that's all I have for this week. As always, an absolutely massive thank you to all the supporters on YouTube, Twitch, GitHub, and Patreon. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.